Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
When he crashed my car and smirked, "Don't worry, Mom and Dad will fix this for me," I felt that familiar tightening in my chest that I have known since middle school when he forgot his homework and somehow I was the one who got sent back during lunch to fetch it. So while the tow truck's orange lights spun lazy circles across the cracked asphalt and the police officer kept telling me I was lucky the airbags did their job, I stared at my brother's grin and realized he wasn't bragging for the crowd or even for me. He was reciting a family tradition that always ended with me paying in time or money or peace, while he floated right over the wreckage, like some smug magician who keeps sawing the same box in half because the audience never complains. I kept my voice steady even though my hands shook and my favorite cardigan smelled like burnt rubber and lemon sanitizer from the hospital parking lot where I work double shifts, and I asked him if he was hurt and he laughed that he was fine and that the old sedan took the hit like a champ, which was ironic and irritating because that old sedan was the first thing I bought with my own savings after years of training shifts and overtime and small side gigs tutoring freshmen who thought APA citations were a myth, and I had babied that car through oil changes and the occasional sad rattle in the winter, so watching it crumpled at the bumper like a crushed soda can made me feel like something small and loyal had raised its hand to help and gotten slapped. The officer asked who owned the vehicle, and before I could open my mouth, Tyler jumped in with that bright, confident voice that makes teachers lean forward and neighbors offer him their ladders, announcing that it was a family car and our dad would be in touch. And I finally produced the registration from my wallet and said very calmly that the car belonged to me alone and that my brother had taken it without asking, which he called a misunderstanding that would have been funny if the radiator hadn't been coughing steam like a dragon with a chest cold. The officer scribbled, Tyler shrugged, and I kept thinking about how he had texted 2 hours earlier with a cheery, borrowing the wheels, promise not to go far, and then turned off his location sharing because that boy has never met a consequence he couldn't swerve around. By the time our parents arrived in their matching windbreakers with the look that says they are here to fix things the way other people show up with casserole, Tyler had already positioned himself between the crumpled hood and my mother's sympathy like an actor hitting his light, and Mom went straight to the officer to ask about next steps while Dad clapped Tyler on the shoulder and said something about boys and bumps, as if a curb had leapt out of the bushes and bit the front axle, and I could feel the script sliding into place, the one where I make nice and agree that the important thing is that everyone is safe, and I accept the check Dad writes with a sorry grin and a lecture about how insurance will handle most of it. And then Tyler gets my spare key back because we are family, and the cycle spins until the next small disaster lands in my lap. I surprised myself by not raising my voice, because the old version of me would have listed all the times my brother promised to pay back what he borrowed and then forgot, and how many hours I have worked without complaint so that the rest of them could keep believing that order falls from the sky like clean snow. Yet anger felt too light for what this moment required, so instead I asked the tow driver to take the car to the shop near my apartment where the owner knows me by name and where receipts actually match reality, and I thanked the officer and took the case number, and I told Mom I would text her later because my shift started at dawn and I needed sleep more than a family postmortem. And when Tyler leaned in and muttered that I should relax because Dad already called his guy at the insurance and they would call it comprehensive or whatever magic word empties the bill, I smiled the way nurses smile when a patient says the internet knows more than medicine. Driving home in the back of a rideshare with the tow truck 2 car lengths ahead of us like a slow, sad chaperone, I replayed his smirk and heard the clink of childhood allowances and broken curfews and the dull thud of excuses that had been wrapped in warm parental language until they sounded like care instead of cover. And I realized that the part of me that had tolerated it all out of habit was finally tired enough to try something quiet and surgical, something that would not need shouting or grandstanding or a lecture that no one would remember by Monday, something that would sit inside the system they trusted and rearrange the levers so that when they pulled the usual handle it would not pour out the usual mercy. I got home, fed the cat, set my shoes by the door, and pulled out my policy folder that I keep in a zip pouch with a dull blue tab because I am the boring adult who labels things. And I read every clause with the focused annoyance of a person who has spent years being told to be reasonable, and I found a line that was not particularly dramatic yet felt like a trapdoor under a stage. And when I called the number on the back of the card and asked a few very careful questions, the woman on the other end confirmed what I suspected in a tone so neutral it sounded like a shrug, and by the time I hung up I knew exactly which form needed to be filed, and how it needed to be described, and why the timing mattered more than anyone in my family would guess. The next morning I wore my usual scrubs and packed my usual lunch and nodded at the usual jokes in the break room, but underneath that surface I carried a different energy, a steady thread of purpose that did not require anyone's permission. And when Mom texted a cheerful update that Dad's friend would push it through, and that we should all meet for dinner to put this behind us, I typed back a polite yes, and then took a quiet detour on my way home to a place where signatures live and digital timestamps tell the truth, and I completed a step that changed the shape of the road we were all driving. Tyler will say later that I blindsided him, that I acted cold, that I made a family problem into a public mess, and maybe he will be right in the way people are right when they finally meet a locked door they assumed would always swing open. For now I am sitting at my kitchen table with the window cracked and the street noise humming and the confirmation email glowing on the screen like a small pale sunrise, and I can already hear my parents telling me that I should have come to them first, but that is the point, isn't it? Because I have always come to them first and last and in the middle, and nothing changed. So this time I will let the process speak for me, and when they try to fix it the way they always do, they will discover that something important has already been fixed without their help. Not this time. The morning after the crash unfolded with that oddly calm choreography families adopt when they are pretending a problem is routine. Because my mother called before sunrise with a hearty voice that tried to fold me into a hug through the speaker while she explained that my father had already spoken to his guy and that I should forward whatever papers came my way so they could bundle everything neatly. And while she moved through her list of reassurances, I stood by the window with my coffee growing cold and watched a neighbor walk her terrier in slow circles, thinking how familiar this script felt and how it always ended with Tyler landing on a soft cushion while I agreed to help sew the cover back on. Yet, even as I murmured that I appreciated the help, I was already sorting receipts and photos into a folder whose brittle precision felt more honest than our family's cheerful damage control. In the late morning, I drove to the shop where my sedan sat like a proud animal that had been hurt doing exactly what it was built to do. And after I listened to the mechanic explain which parts could be salvaged and which would need to be replaced, I took careful pictures of the damage from angles that told the truth without drama. Then I sat in my car with the windows cracked and pulled up my policy documents once more, reading not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as an owner taking responsibility. And although the lines of legalese had intimidated me in the past, they now read like a map through a forest I had walked 100 times in my head, leading to the clause that defined permissive use and the section that clarified what happened when a driver operated the vehicle without my explicit consent, which is the polite insurance way of saying that the bill follows the hands that turned the key. My parents insisted on dinner because big decisions should be made with roasted chicken and good lighting, so I drove across town rehearsing the version of myself that smiles and thanks them and lets the situation be absorbed into our family myth of resilience. Yet when I walked in and saw Tyler leaning against the island with that casual charm that could sell sweaters in July while he told a story about a squirrel darting across the road, I felt something in me settle into place, and I decided that I would not argue, that I would not raise my voice or list the hours I had spent piecing together my life while they stitched his, because the only language that would matter here was the one printed on letterhead that carries weight with banks and bureaucrats. So I let them talk. I let them propose that we file a straightforward claim under comprehensive coverage, and I even agreed to send over the photos and the shop estimate while I salted my potatoes and asked if anyone wanted more green beans. After dinner, Tyler followed me to the driveway with the swagger of a man who believes the credits will always roll at his convenience, and he offered a half apology that sounded like a line he had practiced in the mirror. Something about being careless and being glad I was not mad, and when I asked him where my spare key had gone, he said he would get it back this week, in a tone that implied the key had decided to wander off on adventures. So I surprised both of us by reaching into my bag and handing him a single folded sheet that I had printed on my way over, a notarized note rescinding any implied permission for him or anyone else to drive my car without my written consent, and I watched his smile falter while he tried to laugh it off. Then I tucked the paper back into my bag with a friendly nod and said we would all feel better with clearer boundaries, which sounded pleasant enough while still being a small and satisfying form of revenge, because the door he loved to call family was now a lock with my name on it. The next day, my mother texted another list of instructions from the friend who would grease the gears, and I thanked her for caring because I do not doubt that she loves me. She just loves the certainty of her method more. Then I called my insurer and filed my claim with the language their own representative had recommended, describing the collision as damage resulting from non-permissive use by a named individual, attaching my dated message asking for my car to be returned before his joyride began, appending the mechanic's report, and submitting the notarized letter because it established a tidy timeline that would hold steady when the story started to wobble. And while I felt a ping of guilt at the thought of my parents discovering that I had slipped past their favored channels, I reminded myself that I was not out to destroy anyone. I was simply moving the responsibility to the exact set of shoulders that had carried the grin. In the evening, the group chat lit up with optimism because my father's friend had opened a file and was moving it along, and I responded with a thumbs up because there was no reason to puncture the balloon earlier than necessary. And when Tyler added a joke about me owing him for the upgraded rental he planned to choose, I laughed in that light way that suggests generosity without promising a penny. Then I turned my phone face down and filled out one more form that the representative had emailed, an affidavit clarifying that any rental coverage was suspended for unauthorized drivers, which felt like drawing a firm boundary around a pool where I had been pushed again and again and then scolded for dripping on the floor. By the time my parents realized that their friends' channels were running parallel to a process I had already locked into motion with dates and documents and the dry authority of proper filing, it was too late to stop it. And while I did not cheer, I did allow myself one long breath of relief, because for once the river was flowing where it belonged. The first letter arrived 3 days later in one of those bland white envelopes that never seem important until they split a household storyline down the middle. And when I opened it at my kitchen table with the cat batting at the torn corner, I found the adjuster's acknowledgement that my claim had been logged as damage caused by a non-permissive driver, which in the very polite and very firm language of corporations meant that liability would follow the driver rather than the policy. And although I felt a flutter of guilt at how cold that sounded on paper, I also felt a steadier sensation, something like the click of a seatbelt before a rough patch of road, because I had finally placed the weight where it belonged instead of where it was convenient. My mother insisted that letters like that were always negotiable if you called the right person with the right tone, and as she spoke, she moved through our family kitchen with the efficiency of a woman who can turn chaos into dinner by pure willpower. Yet I could hear the edge beneath the sweetness, the old belief that she had mastered a set of back doors that only needed a knock to swing open. So I let her talk and promised to forward everything while I deleted the part of the email that explained the recorded statement appointment the adjuster had scheduled for me, because I knew exactly how that would sound in our group chat, and I did not intend to rehearse my answers with a committee that had never had a repair bill touch their own accounts. When the adjuster called on a line that began with a tidy disclaimer about recording and accuracy and the importance of truth, I stood by the window where the afternoon sun turned the dust into quiet glitter, and I answered plainly that my brother had taken the car after I had asked for it back, that I had not given verbal or written permission, that he had sent a Johnny message announcing he was borrowing the wheels, and then shut off location sharing, and that I had shown up at the crash to find him performing for the officer like a man auditioning for the role of harmless scamp, and when she asked whether I had ever allowed him to use the vehicle in the past, I said yes, because the truth is not my enemy here. And then I described the notarized note rescinding any implied permission, and the text that preceded his joyride by hours not days, and I could almost hear her pen pause as if she were underlining a sentence she would need later. Tyler continued to treat the situation like a sitcom misunderstanding that would be resolved by a hug before the credits, so when he called to suggest we grab burgers, like old times, and roll our eyes about insurance people, I agreed to meet him in a parking lot that smelled like hot asphalt and fried onions, and I listened while he explained that Dad's friend had told him not to stress because Comprehensive eats this kind of thing for breakfast, and I nodded and asked him, very gently, whether he had already scheduled his own statement with the adjuster because she had mentioned reaching out, and he smirked that he might let the lawyers handle that. At which point I raised my milkshake and told him that was his right and that I sincerely hoped his lawyers liked paperwork more than I did. Then I asked for my spare key again, and he said he would swing by this weekend, which I translated as never. So I prepared a lock change appointment and stopped pretending to wait. The second letter was not bland at all. It was a heavy envelope with the sort of black and white logo that tries very hard not to look like a threat while doing exactly that, and inside was a clear breakdown that read like a ledger of consequences, listing the parts and labor the shop had already itemized, the towing, the diagnostic fees, and the notation that any collision coverage under my policy was declined due to non-permissive operation by a named individual, with a neat paragraph about subrogation that might as well have included a little arrow pointing to my brother's wallet, and when I forwarded the scan to the family thread, my mother called within a minute, her voice prettier than a bow on a grenade, asking why I had not told her there would be language like this, and I said I had told her, just not in the translation she preferred. My father followed with a long message about family solidarity and about how sometimes we eat costs to keep relationships whole, and for a moment I saw him as a young man trying to hold a difficult world together with a good paycheck and a firm handshake, which softened me enough to call him and say carefully that I was not asking him to pay for anything. I was asking him to stop teaching his son that someone else always would, and he exhaled the way men do when they are both tired and proud. Then he pivoted to logistics and asked for the claim number and the adjuster's name, and I gave them to him because transparency does not frighten me, and because I knew that the facts would sit there like a stubborn mule no matter how politely he tugged the rope. When Tyler finally received his own copy of the letter, he texted me a photo of it with a string of laughing capitals that pretended he found it ridiculous. But the glare of the overhead light off the paper made his hand look damp and his thumb knuckle a little white, and I replied that he should save that document somewhere safe, because they often matter later. And I added a smiling punctuation mark that was friendly enough to confuse him, because I had learned that small kindness delivered alongside consequences can feel like a riddle a person must solve on their own, and I would not deny him that education even if he demanded cliff notes. The adjuster scheduled a joint call for verification the following week, and while my parents coordinated their friends' outreach as if two parallel trains could arrive at the same station and play the same music, I gathered bank statements and timestamps and the messages that showed the slow arc of permission given and then withdrawn, building a calm chronology that did not rely on my anger to hold its shape. And as I slid each page into a sleeve, I felt the oddest mixture of sadness and relief. The first because I wish this could have been fixed by an apology and a toolbox, and the second because, for once, the system did not require me to beg for fairness. Late that night, after the house had gone quiet and even the cat had given up on supervising me, a courier knocked with a piece of certified mail addressed not to me but to Tyler at my parents' address. And when I signed for it out of habit, the corner of the green receipt tore off under my pen, a tiny jagged reminder that tidy lines do not guarantee painless stories, so I drove the envelope across town and slid it under their front door without a note. Because whatever clock it started needed to start without my voice, and because some thunderstorms only teach you anything when you stand outside and feel the rain. The morning the rejection letter reached my parents' mailbox, my phone erupted before I had even poured my first cup of coffee, and my mother's voice, sharp with disbelief, filled the kitchen as she demanded to know what exactly I had told the insurance company that could have led them to attack their own family. She had not yet read the entire letter, only the first few lines where it stated that the claim had been officially denied, citing driver liability independent of the policyholder, which to her ears sounded like an accusation carved into stone. I could hear my father pacing in the background, his low muttering blending with the scrape of a chair against tile, and I pictured the scene perfectly, the printed pages spread out like evidence, Tyler hovering with that bewildered frown he wears whenever reality fails to align with his sense of immunity, and my parents circling him with the righteous panic of protectors who can't fathom that their shield has stopped working. I let her speak until the flood of questions turned into the tremble of hurt. Then, in a tone that was neither defensive nor apologetic, I told her that I had answered every question truthfully, that the policy was under my name, and that the company had applied its own rules, which she insisted was impossible because these things are always negotiable. I reminded her gently that negotiation requires leverage, and that, for once, I held all of it. There was a silence so dense I could almost hear her rearranging her understanding of me, of who I was within our family's hierarchy, and I realized that the balance had shifted in a way that would not easily tilt back. By noon, Tyler called with a voice that tried to sound amused but cracked midway, asking what kind of stunt I was trying to pull and whether I understood that I was ruining things for everyone. His confidence, so effortless days earlier, now carried the thinness of paper held too long in the rain. I listened without interruption, letting him run through the usual vocabulary of entitlement, family loyalty, forgiveness, misunderstanding, until he finally fell quiet, expecting me to fill the pause with my usual concession. Instead, I said that for years I had cleaned up his messes and paid the emotional tax of pretending they were storms beyond his control. This one, however, belonged entirely to him. That evening, I stopped by my parents' house because avoidance felt like cowardice, and I wanted to see with my own eyes what denial looked like when stripped of excuses. The air inside was thick with a silence that pulsed louder than any argument. My father was seated at the dining table, the rejection letter folded neatly beside his untouched dinner, while my mother sat opposite, her face drawn and pale. Tyler appeared in the doorway a few seconds later, his eyes red from a mixture of anger and humiliation, and for the first time in years, he didn't meet my gaze with defiance. He looked at me like someone realizing the safety net beneath him had burned away overnight. Dad cleared his throat and asked if there was a way to reverse the process, maybe appeal or submit an amended claim. I told him that the company's decision was final, that any further steps would need to go through legal channels, and that since Tyler was listed as the responsible party, the debt would follow him until it was settled. My mother whispered that this could destroy his credit, as though that were an unthinkable punishment for a moment of carelessness, and I reminded her softly that destruction is what happens when no one repairs what's broken. She flinched at the word broken, perhaps because it implied that the damage had always been deeper than the car. Tyler muttered that I'd stabbed him in the back, and I looked at him long enough for him to feel the weight of every year I had spent pretending not to see how little he respected anything I worked for. I told him that I had not stabbed him, I had simply stopped cushioning his falls. If he chose to call gravity betrayal, that was his problem. My father pushed back his chair so hard it scraped the floor, his voice rising as he accused me of letting some corporate nonsense dismantle our family, but I could see that he wasn't furious at me. He was terrified that his myth of control had finally collapsed. I left before the shouting turned circular, before pity could blur the lines I had drawn. On the drive home, the city lights smeared across my windshield, and for the first time in years I felt an absence of weight. Not joy exactly, but the kind of clarity that comes when a noise finally stops. I parked in front of my apartment and sat in the dark, realizing that revenge, when executed quietly, doesn't roar, it exhales. 2 days later, an envelope arrived addressed to me, bearing the official seal of the finance company that still held the title of the now-ruined car. Inside was a notice confirming that the outstanding loan had been transferred solely into my name, reflecting a refinancing request processed the week before the crash. I had signed that paperwork almost absently at the time, a precaution to protect my own credit, but now it gleamed like an invisible shield I'd built without realizing its full strength. I ran my fingers over the embossed letterhead and understood that, by some strange symmetry, I had liberated myself entirely from their reach. The car, the debt, the expectation that I would always bend. That night, Tyler sent me one final message. It was short, raw, and for the first time honest. "I didn't think you'd actually do it," he wrote. I stared at the words until the screen dimmed and then locked my phone without replying. There was nothing left to explain. Some lessons are only learned through loss, and some families only discover truth when protection ends. And though my apartment felt too quiet, the silence no longer felt like punishment, it felt like peace earned through fire. In the days that followed the rejection, when the noise finally drained from our group thread and my parents retreated into that strained politeness couples use when their favorite story has stopped cooperating, I found myself rehearsing the conversation I had avoided from the beginning, the one where I would have to explain not the letters or the clauses or the tidy statements that had marched across official paper, but the second phone call I had made while Tyler was still laughing with the officer and my father was dialing his friend with the confident rhythm of a man who believed the back door would always be unlocked. A call that did not raise its voice or announce revenge yet rearranged the room so thoroughly that when they eventually reached for their usual levers their hands closed on air, because the finance company, which had once regarded my father as a cosigner with a permanent key, now regarded me alone as owner and decision-maker thanks to a quiet refinance I had completed the week before, and because the family policy that had for years grouped our cars like a bundle of protected eggs had been politely unwound. My individual coverage lifted out and sealed with a rider that specifically limited permissive use to written consent, a clause that looks dull until it is lit by the friction of entitlement. I did not tell them this during the arguments because in our family information has always been currency paid to the loudest bidder, and I no longer felt obligated to bankroll anyone else's comfort. So I kept the details until the adjuster's final packet arrived with its careful summary of findings, the subrogation notice that followed Tyler like a shadow, and the request for confirmation that no other drivers would be added to my policy without my explicit, documented approval, at which point I drove to my parents' house in the late afternoon when the sun flattens the neighborhood into quiet photographs, and I sat at the same dining table where we had celebrated small victories with paper hats and big disappointments with roast chicken. And I laid the documents out in a row not as a weapon, but as a mirror that would finally show us all the shape of the thing we had built together. My father flipped through the packet with the deliberation of a man who reads contracts for sport, and I watched his eyes slow over the date stamps that placed my decisions before their interventions, while my mother traced the embossed letterhead as if texture could soften content, and Tyler hovered at the doorway, unwilling to sit because chairs commit you to witness. Then asking in a voice that tried to stay light whether I had planned this all along as if planning were a crime rather than the only tool I ever had. And I said that I did not plan a crash because even in my irritation I am not a villain, but I did plan to stop outsourcing my life to other people's promises, which meant placing safeguards around the thing I worked to own. And if those safeguards also taught him that the ground has rules, then maybe that was not cruelty so much as gravity making a late entrance. He asked if there was a way back, a workaround, a back channel, something that would make this a funny story later, and I told him there was always a way forward, though forward sometimes looks like a payment plan and a second job and a calendar that rations pride. And while he stared at the table, I slid a small envelope toward him containing a single page I had drafted the night before, a written agreement that if he took full responsibility, provided confirmation of the insurer's payment schedule, and returned my spare key by the end of the week, I would sign a letter of non-opposition that might help him avoid additional penalties when the company circled back to verify cooperation. An offer that did not erase the bill or the bruise yet proved that I was not chasing ruin, only alignment, and as he read he muttered that I was cold, then paused when he reached the final line that promised I would also send the dash camera footage, yes, the old unit I had installed months ago. Because hospital parking lots don't inspire optimism, directly to his lawyer rather than the insurer, which would save him one fight he could not afford to lose, provided he stopped treating my boundaries like furniture he could rearrange. The room held its breath while he weighed a future where the loudest words would not buy him exits, and for a moment I almost softened, seeing in him a child who had learned the wrong lesson too well. Yet I stayed quiet because some lessons can only be found in the spaces after silence, and at last he nodded, a small movement that felt heavier than all the shouting, and he signed. and my mother pressed her fingers to her lips like a woman trying to remember the prayer for humility, and my father opened his mouth, closed it, and finally said that he hated the world where paperwork mattered more than love, and I told him that love without accountability is only shelter for storms that never end, and none of us looked at one another for a long time. That night I drove home on a different route that wound past the river because water has a way of sounding like truth when it refuses to hurry, and at a red light I glanced at the passenger seat where the spare key lay heavy as a small verdict. And I thought about revenge, and how I had imagined it in brighter colors when I was younger, all fireworks and applause, only to learn that the most satisfying victories whisper, and then keep whispering long after you stop admiring them, and I wondered whether peace would ever feel less like an empty room and more like a choice I had made on purpose, and whether my parents would forgive me for refusing to play the role they loved best, and whether Tyler would actually follow the steps we had written together or find some new clever escape that would make this chapter only a pause. When I reached my building, a message from the adjuster blinked across my screen confirming receipt of a cooperation letter signed by the driver and acknowledging my notarized boundary document on file for future incidents. A bureaucratic phrase that sounded almost like a benediction, and I stood by the elevator listening to the quiet hum of the cables and realized that I had built myself a life with doors that close and open because I say so, which is not dramatic and not pretty, and strangely the only comfort I have ever trusted. Then, as if summoned by the thought, my phone buzzed again with a single line from my brother. "I dropped the key in your mailbox. Thanks for not sending the video." And I smiled without celebration because this was not a victory lap, it was a road that kept going. I fell asleep that night with the window cracked and the city carrying its ordinary noises through the screen, and sometime toward morning I woke to a sensation I could not name. Not joy, and not regret, and not relief. Something like standing on the edge of a dock with fog hiding the far shore, knowing I had done what was necessary and afraid it might never feel like enough. And as the first light pushed at the blinds, I understood that some crashes rearrange metal, and some rearrange families, and some rearrange the invisible architecture of a person's life, and it is impossible to predict which kind you are surviving until the wreckage stops smoldering, and even then the smoke takes its time, and perhaps that is the truest consequence of all. That you can fix the car, settle the claim, draw the boundary, and still wake wondering whether justice and mercy ever truly meet in the same place, or whether we simply drive on, hoping the next turn reveals more than it hides.